This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, live from, the DuPont Circle. It's What the Hell's Going On. Mark, what the hell is going on now?
Well, in addition to the fact that we're in the studio together, which means you can actually hit me as opposed to reaching across the screen and hitting
I already
me.
have once.
I know you did. I should have sat on the other side of the studio.
On the other side of the guest.
But in addition to all the other reason is that we're here with our guest, Adam O'Neill, who's the new opinion editor at the Washington Post. He's both the new opinion editor at the Washington Post and also a veteran correspondent who spent a lot of time living in and covering Europe. And so he talks to us today a little bit about what his new vision is for the Washington Post and for the opinion page there, and also, looking at Europe and how it informs his thinking about America.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this a lot on the podcast about how the political ructions that are going on inside Europe are, sort of one step away and in our future if we don't get a grip on untrammeled immigration, if we don't get a grip on anti-Semitism, if we don't get a grip on just who is coming to our country and why. And that ship has already sailed, I think, for a lot of European countries. It was really interesting to talk to somebody who covered this, especially for a magazine like The Economist, which Adam worked for, because inside Europe, I would say there's a lot less press diversity than there is in America. And we forget. I mean, we're elitist coastal people, so we see the Post, the New York Times, and it's true. We see the Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Do you read whatever they put out in Kansas City, Mark?
Oh, I read a lot of stuff that's in my Twitter feed that is not from those sources.
Yeah, that's me too.
Yeah, I think Twitter has actually diversified our reading portfolio because somebody can write something in the Kansas City paper and
you'll see it.
And you'll see it because I follow them on Twitter and they'll post it, or they'll just tweet out stuff from the center of the country that's not in any of those places. And if I have a bunch of people I follow who I found really interesting who actually don't even publish in any of those newspapers.
So I really like that too. I especially like it, as our listeners know, because I hear first what's going on in foreign countries, and I follow a lot of people in the Middle East, and so I really enjoy reading what's going on there and reading it first. But I miss the paper. I think a lot of people. And, this is obviously a matter of age. If you're a Gen Z, if you're Gen Alpha, then the idea that you want to go out to your front walk and pick up a paper and open it up and look at it is absolutely alien. But, when I used to drive, when I was a journalist, I used to drive to our office every day, because, of course, we went to the office every day, even as journalists. We'd listen to NPR every morning. And
can't do that anymore.
And I can't, it's not that I can't do that anymore. It's that it makes my blood boil to listen to it. And the same was becoming true, I think, in certain sectors of journalism. And so I really like the idea that my hometown paper, which used to be the Boston Globe, to be fair, which really sucks, and sucked even then. Even when I could listen to NPR, I couldn't read the Boston Globe. But that my hometown paper in the most important capital, and the most important and the most powerful and the richest country in the world is actually a paper I want to read. That should make a difference to people.
I agree, it does, and it's terrific that we've got these changes underfoot. It's exciting. I've been at the Post for almost something like 15 years now.
Is that right?
Yep, absolutely.
Damn, dude.
Exactly. I wrote a few op-eds, but I think I wrote my first column in 2010. In February of 2010.
Is that right?
Yeah. So I've been there for a long time, and I've always been treated wonderfully. Fred Hyatt and
no
Jackson
matter who was
Deal
there,
were terrific. Sure. So was David Shipley. I've always been welcomed, but I was always an outsider in the liberal House, and I think now it's just becoming a much more diverse page, and I think it's going to bring in a lot of readers who like you who left, and I think that's good for the paper and it's good for the country.
But let me, we didn't talk about this with Adam, and we probably should have. But I want to raise I want to raise an issue that I thought was emblematic of this, which is Trump's remodeling or a destruction, if you're Hillary Clinton, of the East Wing.
Yes.
Now, I will be honest with you. I always say the same thing when people propose to talk to me about this, which is I don't care. I'm not interested. I don't want to talk about it. But what it feels like if you're in Washington, D.C., is that there is a Politburo. Right. And that Politburo gets on every morning and it tells CNN and MSNBC and, what used to be the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Atlantic and the Nation and the New Republic, which still exists, folks. I know I didn't believe it either. And all of the sort of, crazy never Trumpers who've become more left wing than the lefties themselves, like the Bulwark. They get that message, right? It comes at 6 a.m. This is all we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Donald Trump's destruction of our heritage. We're going to talk about how awful it is, what a bad man he is. We're not going to talk about the government shutdown, right? Because, who cares about that? We're not going to talk about, the ending of SNAP benefits to people around the country. We're not going to talk about what Russia is doing, right? We're not going to talk about any of that. We're not going to talk about Hamas. We're going to talk about the East Wing. And the Washington Post, just like a freaking breath of fresh air.
Yep.
And again, not because I think that Donald Trump has good taste, because damn, I don't. And not because I think that he goes about everything in the right way, but in the scope of things, the notion that a bunch of frankly prefab-looking buildings, which constituted the East Wing, which were last renovated in the 1940s, should be
the cover
renovated.
of a bomb shelter.
Right.
Yeah.
Should be renovated in order that when the president hosts a state dinner for somebody like the King of England, he doesn't have to use a porta potty, which, by the way,
it was a thing.
Right, is a thing. I know. I don't know if folks knew that, but the idea that he was going to do that and remedy that situation does not seem to me to be the most important thing all of us can talk about for a solid week.
Yep. And the Post editorial was a breath of fresh air on that. But also, I will tell you, I was in the Bush administration when George W. Bush ordered that the entire sit room be demolished, which was the iconic Situation Room where JFK managed the Cuban Missile Crisis and where
managed, in quotes.
And yes, exactly. But I mean, where Nixon planned the opening to China, where all this historic moments in American history happened, and it was torn down and replaced by 3 big, giant with a small, a medium, and a large size sit room with modern technology that was for the moment and all the rest of it. I don't remember this hue and cry over destroying our heritage and all the rest of it. And actually, the old sit room they took all the wall panels and they put them in there. You can actually sit in it in the Bush Library
really?
Today. Yes, they saved the sit room and it still exists.
I've never been there. I have to go.
Oh,
to the
you
Bush
have to go.
Library.
It's a terrific library.
Yeah.
But no one because it was Bush doing it, and so it's not quite. It wasn't quite the same. So I think that whole controversy, but that's just emblematic.
Just this diktat. Be normal. Think about things like you're a normal human being. How much do people think that even a Democrat in Dubuque is thinking about the East Wing? Yeah. The answer is not at all. Yeah. And yet the nation's media was obsessed with it. And I think picking that issue, for me, that says a lot about where the Washington Post is going. And I'm happy about it. I confess to you. Maybe I have friends who will not be happy about it, but I think it's a welcome breeze in a town that is a swamp in too many ways.
And we could have a nice ballroom like they have in the ballrooms of Europe, which brings us to the topic that we're talking about with Adam, which is that Europe is in deep trouble. And one of the guiding lights of the Post editorial page today is don't be like Europe.
Right. Don't be like Europe, which was, the birthplace of the Renaissance, the birthplace of the Reformation, the Roman Empire.
We can be like that Europe. I'm talking about Europe today.
But right. But I mean, think about when people. I think there's a lot of complacency about America in America. That can't happen to us, right? I'm never going to be in a country where I have to wait 2 years for a doctor's appointment like you do in a lot of Europe.
Or Canada.
Right. Well, I'm never going to be in a country where I can't get a wheelchair ramp and they offer me instead whether I want to be euthanized and then have my organs harvested. Yeah, because that's for real a thing in Canada. So, and the answer is no, those things can happen to us too. And they happen slowly, but you become trapped. You become trapped in a welfare state where you can't choose between guns and butter. You have to go with butter. And you become, you what is it, slouch towards Gomorrah?
Yes.
We slouch towards Gomorrah. Was that pork?
That was Robert Bork.
Yeah,
yes.
My gosh. Well, scholar at AEI, so I guess I'm quoting from the best. But
Exactly.
that can happen to us, and it's good to have a newspaper that understands that actually, liberty, freedom, prosperity, those are things. We
Yep.
like those things.
Well, let's turn to the editor of that page to tell us more.
So Adam O'Neill is the opinion editor at the Washington Post. Before joining the Post, he was a correspondent for The Economist. He was an executive editor for The Dispatch. He was a Wall Street Journal editorial writer. And, of course, let's not forget that he also worked for Rome Reports.
In the Vatican. He was a
At the
Vatican
Vatican.
correspondent. Yes.
So everybody needs to start in Rome.
All roads lead to Rome, right? And all roads lead to what the hell is going on. Here's our interview. Well, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me here. I'm excited to talk about what the hell is going on and how Washington Post opinion tries to figure out what the hell is going on and how to explain it to our readers.
We're all in the same place.
We're all
here
in the same
Washington.
business, explaining what the hell is going on. Well, so what the hell is going on at the Post? You just became opinion editor of the Post, and you're starting. You have a deep history in covering Europe. So how do you think about Europe at the Post, and how does that inform your thinking about America?
Sure. When I started this job, I spent a lot of time thinking about not just what are tactical political positions or policy disputes that we'll weigh in on, but what are the big overarching themes or battles that we want to fight in the war of ideas. And lots of ideas come up. We want the United States to beat China in the competition for global dominance. And what exactly do we want out of that competition? We'll figure out with the editorial board, and we'll talk through and we'll report. And one of the ideas among the many, there's AI, China, right, the U.S. economy, dynamism, that sort of thing. But one of the themes that I kept coming back to was we don't want the United States to become Europe. And simply put, and I say this as someone
Amen.
Who's lived in Europe for about 5 years, have real love for that continent and many people there. I have a lot of family in Europe, and who knows, maybe someday we'll live there again. I don't know.
Your family's Polish by background, right?
Yeah, my mother's from Poland. And I have tremendous respect for a lot of things about Europe, but the lack of dynamism, the lack of ambition culturally, the inability to defend itself, the fact that very few successful companies, world-class companies, come out of Europe, that's not a future that I want for the United States. And it's not just you write one editorial about that and, okay, great, we're not Europe, but thinking through on a daily basis, what are the policy questions, what are the developments in American business and culture, in academia, and how can we keep that ambition in the United States and not become Europe, so to speak.
So what are the things about Europe you don't want to become? Because, I mean, there's obviously the economic dynamism, there's foreign policy weakness. There's a whole host of things to choose from.
Well, I lived in Brussels. Here's one example. There are many, right? But one that I always thought was a really telling anecdote. I became friends with someone who worked at the European Commission, who, not a bureaucrat, a Eurocrat, as they say, and she worked in regulation of something. That's what they all do essentially.
That's all do.
And
Cucumber length, probably.
And we were talking about the difference between U.S. and America, which was not the only, or U.S. and Europe, which was not the only thing I talked about in Europe, but it often came up with my European friends. And one thing that she said to me that stood out was, I'm making fun of the U.S. for something, we're all fat, or school shootings, or we don't have health care, the things that always come up with Europeans. And I said, it's kind of nice to be a superpower or whatever. It was some kind of reflexively. And she said, Adam, but you misunderstand. Europe is a regulatory superpower. And I was so embarrassed for her. That's not something to be proud of.
What's that line? America innovates, Europe regulates, and China God, it's
Something to do with stealing.
something to do with stealing. Exactly. China imitates.
Right. And I think China's probably speeding ahead. Like that might need some updating because the Chinese, electric vehicles and some new technological innovations, maybe not on airplane production or certain kinds of really advanced semiconductors, but even the Chinese have really begun to innovate more in recent years. But Europe doesn't really happen. France's inability to produce a viable COVID vaccine is just one example. The Brits pulled it off, so credit to them. But the idea that it was the United States, China, Russia, the UK, but a country the size of Germany with that kind of economy couldn't put together a COVID vaccine, that sort of thing. And a lot of the ambitious young Europeans I met, people who were working in startups, who had ideas to make the world a better place and make a lot of money, which great things to combine together, they all viewed their terminal goal as ending up in San Francisco or New York with their companies. And there's some ambition. I knew some business people in Europe, but when you look at who's the wealthiest in Europe, it's always people who inherited money. And I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but if you look at self-made billionaires in the U.S. versus Europe, the difference there kind of shows you something about the differences in our culture.
Well, it's not just that. If you look back 30, 40 years ago, you're looking at a GDP per capita in Europe and the United States that was roughly the same. And now we are about 30% ahead of them, and we are continuing to grow, and we are continuing to dominate the global economy. And they, for all the reasons you suggested and more, are not. It's interesting. Two of our colleagues here at AEI, Charles Murray and Nick Eberstadt. So Charles wrote a book some years ago, not his most recent book, which was about religion, or even the one before that, but the one before that was called Coming Apart. And it was about how America is dividing into class bubbles, right? Where it's not just that people of one class, if you went to Harvard Law School, you were going to marry someone who went to Harvard Law School or Yale Law School. You were never going to marry, the daughter of the guy who owned the gas station in your town, which was much more the case in the old days. And so we have a very class-striated society, which is just like Europe. And Nick Eberstadt has written incredibly two great books about people in America who don't work. And of course, you lived in Rome, right, where not working is, right, there's called the reddito di cittadinanza, which basically is Bernie's basic wage. You get 200 euros a week, you live with your mom, she does the laundry, you go out with your friends, you buy cigarettes, and your mom pays for the rest of the food, and life is good.
Yeah, and as someone from Southern California, a little more chill vibe, I mean, it's not that it doesn't appeal to me. I think sometimes it's something inside of me is like, maybe I should just go to Rome and live off 1,000 euros a month. But and I will say this also about Europe. I don't want to sound jingoistic like, USA, baby, US is the best in the world. Like, I do think we're the greatest country in the world, and I think there's plenty of reasons for that. But I also think we can learn things from Europe. There are certain things that they do well, right? I don't look at our healthcare system and think like that's a model for the world. Certainly the French one isn't either, but we make plenty of mistakes, and Europe is still a 20 trillion, the EU at least is a $20 trillion economy for 450 million people. A lot of people live very nice lives there. Fewer and fewer, and it's becoming less sustainable, but there are things that we can learn. And countries, the Nordic countries, they're not these robust, they have a more robust welfare state than we do, but they also have in many ways very intense capitalism. So we also look to Europe for cautionary tales, but also where we can improve. And one other thing I'd add, and I'm rambling on and on, but one other thing I'd add is Europe still matters. 450 million people, 20 trillion in economic output, and hundreds of billions of dollars in military spending and going up. So when I went to Finland and I would talk to politicians there, they'd tell me, hey, we can call up more soldiers in 24 hours or in 48 hours than the Germans can. Little Finland compared to Germany, the most populous European country. There's still tremendous military and economic power, and it matters that we have an alliance with Europe. You just don't want to have the United States be a country full of people who lack ambition.
I want to follow up. You actually did a really interesting interview with was the Prime Minister of Finland when you were at the Journal, and talked about some of these issues and talked about Finland joining NATO. So we are, I think, becoming more like Europe in bad ways. There's no question. Although, again, we're still the United States of America, as you rightly point out, and there are very, very important things that distinguish us, not just being the fattest people. Although I think other countries have taken that over at this point. But I wonder, has Europe reached an inflection point as well? Have Russia and Ukraine, together with Trump kind of saying, people, wake the hell up, has that created a new outlook in Europe, or is this just a blip?
There's also the question of what is Europe, right? Poland thinks about foreign policy in a very different world than Spain. And I've lived in both of those countries. I have lots of friends in both of those countries. I've talked to politicians there. And the Finns, when I was up talking to the president, and he was very confident and very rooted in history, talking about when the Russians invaded not that long ago. Still plenty of people around who actually can remember that. Not as many as there used to be, certainly, but those memories are still fresh. So Poland has completely woken up. I think they're an ideal ally. They're spending way more than we would expect on defense not because we're lecturing them, but because they need to. And you have Spain, which is led by a corrupt socialist prime minister who's should be on his way out and doesn't really seem to have any reason for staying in power other than his desire for power. Someone like that, who's a reasonable person, I've been to meetings with him and he speaks English very well and can articulate his points, but there's no real bigger goal there that I can discern other than staying in power, helping this particular group because they're part of your coalition. And that's how you end up with a country that is not really interested in defense and not really interested in a more cohesive vision for their future. So there's a lot to criticize about Europe as a whole. And even the polls will say there are things we need to be doing better. We need to be thinking on continental scales when it comes to business, and we don't do that. But at the same time, it's country by country. And my question is, when is there a tipping point where countries like Spain or Hungary are shamed into doing more and being more responsible citizens in the European community? And I don't know when that will come. I don't know if they're there yet. But that's my hope as someone who loves Europe and wants the best for the West more broadly.
I think the West is almost a better term for it because Europe is almost a misnomer. I mean, Danny loves when I bring up my Rumsfeldisms. But, there was a famous moment when Rumsfeld was asked something about Europe, and he said, well, do you mean old Europe or new Europe? And he was referring to sort of the sense of gravity had moved east in Europe, and it was the Poles and the Baltic states who had the momentum. And
he never embraced Romania, Bulgaria, and that part of New Europe, did he?
He actually kind of did. But yes, he did. But thank you. But you can go in and get your Rumsfeld shots in. He's not around to push back, so I'll do it for him. But anyway, if you look at, for example, Poland right now, Poland is about to surpass Britain in per capita GDP by 2030. That's partly because Poland is growing, but it's also because Britain is not in the same way it used to. You mentioned Finland can call up more people than Germany. It used to be the center of gravity was Germany, France, Britain. And now the center of gravity in Europe has changed in I think in more positive ways.
No, I completely agree. And it's one thing to have the biggest GDP in Europe, and I think Germany will for the foreseeable future. But there's matters of hard power, and you can debate different military capabilities. And the Germans should be embarrassed of how they've let their military fall into disrepair. They've turned it around, not nearly as much as they should have over the past 3 years. But it's clear that even if Poland doesn't beat Germany in GDP, when it comes to really pulling around muscle and showing what they can do, the Poles should have a seat at the table in a way that they didn't previously. And a lot of that is just muscle memory. And I think one of my critiques of Joe Biden was that he supported alliances for the sake of having an alliance, to the point that he would remove sanctions on Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline, just to make the Germans happy, even though it totally undermined Europe. And that was one of the great strategic, not even tactical, strategic errors of the Biden administration. But another fault in his thinking was that European policy runs through Berlin. And Biden was an old school guy. He'd been doing foreign policy since the 70s. And sure, there was some experience there, but a lot of that was outdated. So there were a lot of meetings where you'd see the French and the Germans with Biden. Maybe you'd add in someone else, like some bureaucrat or someone based in Brussels who I don't really know why they're there, but he thinks is important. And more often, you'd be wondering, like, where are the people who actually have the bombs and the guns and the ability to defend themselves? And we have plenty of critiques of Donald Trump and his approach, and maybe if he goes too far. But one of the benefits of Donald Trump and his unorthodox approach is he can just look at facts as they are. He's not a big reader
Not
of
beholden
history.
to the past.
Yeah, and there's a positive way, which is he's not rooted in history, or another is he's just giving it a fresh look, and he can go and see the polls, be happy with what they're doing, and support them. Now, I don't think the polls like everything that Donald Trump does. They're probably a little more skeptical of Putin, to say the least. And I think understandably, in U.S. foreign policy would be better off if Biden and Trump listened to Poland a little more. We don't have to make this the Poland podcast, but it's
all
just
right.
one.
I'm
It's
in
one.
favor of it.
It's one example. It's one example. But you need to constantly reevaluate these things. And if you get locked into that way of foreign policy thinking, and that's something I say to the editorial board when we're talking through these issues, because we're thinking of everything on a blank slate. It's a new era at the editorial board. We don't have to be beholden to the way things used to work. Now, we're interested in American interests and promoting our values and doing what's best for people in America, but we work backward from that. And when we look at Europe, that can take you to places that it might not have in the 80s or 90s.
So, for me, I think one of the I totally agree with you, by the way, that Biden really was sort of trapped, like a little bug in amber in a different era. And of course always so immodest that he would never revisit the truths that he knew to be self-evident because he thought them. But for me, one of the most jarring things about Europe is not France, right? France really has been in a slow motion collapse for a very, very long time. It wasn't just Mitterrand and Chirac and the corruption. It was the fact that they took in all of these, what used to be called pieds noirs from North Africa, and didn't give a damn about integrating them and put them in these ghettos south of Paris that have now turned into, little jihadi camps. So France, and Germany similarly, has been really problematic for quite a long time. We talk about Nord Stream, but of course remember Schröder and what a whore he was for the Russians, and then
Still
ended up and still is.
Isn't he still with Gazprom?
I think he is still
Yes,
with Gazprom.
there you go.
And of course your favorite Angela Merkel, who's now turned out to be just a lot more like him than we realized. Where the change happened that I think has shocked me and led me to believe that actually Europe is in real trouble is in the UK, where you have the complete and total collapse of the Tories, right? Where the Tories have basically become the Democratic Party. Maybe it's a little more conservative on one or two issues, but mostly not, right? So you have you are so bankrupt on the right that Reform is now running leaps and bounds ahead of any other party and the by-elections that they just had. But it's not just that. It is that the place, the demonstrations, the murders in Manchester, the terrorist attack, the demonstrations in London, the pro-Pal contingent. It just looks like England's over. And that England was really our buddy system. Right? It wasn't France. It wasn't Germany. It was England, and even the Anglosphere, Canada. My God, really, South Africa, Australia. These countries are headed in a terrible direction. That's what worries me.
Union of English-speaking peoples is not doing so well.
It's not doing so well.
And this is one of the cautionary tales. I will say, having lived in Europe, like I said, several countries over several years, and having spent most of my life in the United States, I think that the United States does a better job of absorbing immigrants. I'm a little biased. I'm the son of an immigrant. A lot of members of my family are immigrants. But no, I think it's one of our superpowers. We're just better at it than the Europeans are. So I start with the position that if I were a European, I'd probably be a little more skeptical of immigration than I currently am. I think it's one of the it's one of their great weaknesses when I think about Europe versus the United States. At the same time, they showed, and our previous president would have benefited maybe from this view, is that total open borders are unacceptable to normal people, and they're not racist and they're not xenophobic. They just look around and they don't like the chaos, and they don't like people who don't assimilate. And I think that even when the U.S. had open borders, you can get better in assimilation than you would in Europe. And the second part of that, though, is that, and you're seeing this in the U.K., as you said, with the Tories collapsing and Nigel Farage looking like a possible PM. Sentences I never thought I would say, but
Right.
a realistic.
Right.
Maybe he's peaking a little too early. This happens. We all thought Salvini in Italy would become PM. I don't think the AfD in Germany will, but maybe I'll listen to this in a couple of years and say, how are you so naive? But when you don't let mainstream parties like the Tories and Labour in the UK or the Republicans and the Democrats in the US, if one of those parties doesn't handle a very real problem, other parties will come. And that's why you have people like Le Pen in France ready to go. And if they allow her to run,
Right.
we'll probably win in 2027, I think it is. Or the AfD in Germany, they're the most popular party. I think they still get blocked out. But throughout Europe, and you could pick plenty of smaller examples where this happens, and that's just from elites not willing to recognize a real problem. And that's something we can learn and we don't want to imitate in Europe. And frankly, something Europe can learn from us, because my view is that Donald Trump has gone a little too far on the immigration enforcement since he came, and he's seen some backlash from that. Even if Donald Trump goes too far and the U.S. has a way of zigzagging on immigration, people will prefer that and they'll vote for him, and he'll have an unimaginable comeback because the other party for too long didn't want to recognize it was a problem, and when they finally did, they lost all credibility.
Yeah.
So you've written about Brexit when you were at the Journal. Wasn't Brexit supposed to solve this problem? I've tweeted out a couple of times, like, remember when the big problem in Britain was the Polish plumber? It's not the Polish plumber anymore. I thought that the whole point of Brexit was they were going to get control of their borders again. They were going to start bringing in, controlling immigration, bringing in people who actually wanted to be British, wanted to assimilate, wanted to be part of the society. And it seems like is this all pre-Brexit immigration, or has there been no enforcement of Brexit, or what went wrong?
One problem, and that's, you can write books, people will be studying this question for decades, so I don't want to be trite about it. But I think the biggest problem, immigration is a piece of it, certainly, but when they left the EU, the idea is they wouldn't have to follow EU regulations. Yeah. And they did very superficial things. They changed the color of the passport, the sizes of the cups. They could be in cups and quarts instead of milliliters, EU regulations, that sort of thing. Well, there was a lot of that. But there wasn't real economic reform in the reset that the UK needed. And that was, to me, the tragedy of Brexit. It was a gamble, and at the time, I was in my early mid-20s when Brexit happened. I opposed it because not because I had some great geopolitical foresight, but I just didn't trust the Brits on their own to have this free market revolution that would be necessary to make Brexit worth it. And there are downsides. You lose efficiencies by not being part of the single market in the UK or in the European Union. And so they lost that, but without becoming Singapore on Thames or whatever the cliche was. And I think that was the fundamental error. Immigration was part of it, and not making a clean break. The way that it played out over the years, whether I was living there or I was visiting during Brexit. And now the problem is not the Polish plumber in the UK. I always joke with my British friends or my former colleagues at The Economist, soon, it'll be the British plumber in Warsaw looking for a job, trying to steal one of those high-paying jobs for Polish natives, coming in. I mean, it's an exaggeration, but I don't think we're that far off. Certainly in my lifetime, it's something I could imagine seeing.
Wow.
So, I mean, right, what people don't understand, and I think, by the way, when I say people, I don't think Brits understand, I certainly don't think Americans understand, is that when you became part of the European Union, as the UK did, it's not simply that you're now part of it and their plumbers can come and be your plumbers. It is that you integrate your legal systems. And so 70% of British law and British regulation was EU law and EU regulation. And unwinding that is, it's like a very, very complex divorce, right? Rupert Murdoch could tell us about this. And if you don't have a good prenup, which I would say the UK did not, then you are in a lot of trouble. The other thing, Mark, that is of interest to you, of course, is that the European Court of Human Rights was part of the package, but the UK didn't leave it. And so when you see Giorgia Meloni trying to send people to Albania, when Albania agrees to accept migrants that are going to be deported from the UK, and the Italian court system turns it around with a view to the European Court of Human Rights, the same is true in the UK when they try and send people to Rwanda, if you remember, under the previous government. They just, you can't. And they are still, their hands are inextricably tied with the EU in ways that I think they fail to appreciate. And as you rightly say, they haven't been bold at all in disentangling themselves. But I mean, who is bold in old Europe, if I can use rummy as a formulation? Who do you like? Who do you look at? Because you mentioned Le Pen.
Meloni.
Well, I love Meloni.
I love Meloni.
That's,
She's my favorite European leader.
But there's Farage, there's the AfD, there's Le Pen, who suddenly decided to become pro-Israel and stop being an anti-Semite like her father, and there are a lot of other parties on the far right. Who do you like?
I probably could have given you a better answer 3 years ago when I was still writing about this full time, 3.5 years ago. But now that I've come back to the U.S. and my duties have widened, every time I pull up, Politico or something, and I see, like German local elections, interesting. But then I think, all right, that's a little too in the weeds. You've got a much broader now. Maybe you should keep an eye on the Virginia race, right? You're working at the Washington Post now. But on a more serious note, there's no single figure in Europe who I think of as a Thatcher, right, or even a bolder European around the post-war era. There's no Václav Havel walking around Europe that I can think of. Merz has made some progress in Germany, but I still think he's kind of boxed in. Meloni has surprised me pleasantly. You're always a little worried about Italians that they might turn out to be too pro-Russian, but
she's the opposite. She's been great.
And I think what Europe really needs is an editorial page, an opinion section that advocates for free markets and personal liberties. Because there's not if the European leaders could be reading more about that, I think that would take them a long way. But when I think globally, the leader that I'm most intrigued by is Javier Milei in Argentina.
Do tell why.
And that's someone who, we talk about the West, I think.
Which is sort of Europe.
Yeah, Steven. Yeah, I mean, he certainly would like to be. I mean, he wants to join NATO. I talked about the Brits about that.
Yeah.
If you ever go to Argentina, all of the cult around
the Malvinas.
On the sides of buses it says Las Malvinas son Argentinas because they don't call it the Falkland Islands, right? It's Las Malvinas, and they belong to Argentina, as every child in Argentina learned. So they'd have a territorial dispute that would complicate their NATO accession. But Milei is. Talking to folks in Argentina, it's a shame that they had to hit rock bottom first, but he's doing the painful things, right? He's cutting spending. You're going from 4.4% of GDP, the budget deficit, to a balanced budget. Took office 2 years ago. Inflation, and again, if inflation were 30% in the U.S., it would be crazy, but that's a triumph because it was 200% in Argentina. And Milei has a long way to go. He was too timid. He should have dollarized. Maybe it was just politically impossible. He should be letting the peso float. There are a lot of ways that this could go wrong. But 2 years in, he's doing the hard things to bring in investment, to liberalize their economy. And most importantly, he's explained to voters, this is not going to be fun or easy, but the Peronists have so badly screwed up this country, and we need to collectively do better. And I need a couple more years to do that. And he just won a resounding victory. It's tough to call 41% a landslide, but in their system, that's just about a landslide. And so I'm profoundly impressed with Milei. He's not perfect. He's a bit of an oddball. Sometimes you watch clips of him on Argentinian TV. It's like, don't show that to your children under 13. Like it's a PG, a little rated R kind of conversations that he has, but he's a visionary in a way that we don't really see. You don't have a Milei in the decadent countries of Europe. It's a sort of a new energy. And if you think about like the way that Stephen Kotkin does is the West as including Japan and South Korea, and it being more of an idea than a physical location between like the transatlantic alliance. Milei desperately wants his country to be part of the West. He does not like the Chinese leadership. He does not like the Russian leadership. He wants to align with the United States. And so that's the country where a lot of things could still go wrong. And when he makes mistakes, there are bigger problems than if the Spanish or the Poles make mistakes. But that's the one leader when I look around the world who I'm impressed by, and I'm curious to see how this experiment unfolds. No guarantee of success by any means, but the fact that he made it through these midterms and has another shot is it's quite an accomplishment for Argentina.
Well, you hit on something which is a sort of a thesis I've always believed in, which is the great leader theory of history, right? That you really need great leaders in order to turn things around. It was just divine providence that we had Thatcher, Reagan, and John Paul II at the very moment we needed them to defeat communism. And that it doesn't seem, with the exception of Maloney, doesn't seem like there's the great leaders emerging in Europe. You hit. I mean, the fact we asked you who do you admire in Europe, and you went to Argentina. It says something about Europe, doesn't it?
Slim pickings. I mean, there may be also a great leader, like I said, maybe in, I don't know, one of the smaller European countries who, if he was in charge of a couple $1 trillion of GDP and tens of millions of people, maybe would be more significant. But Macron, a lot of us had high hopes for him, and that project has been disrailed. And he certainly, I don't know if he had high hopes. I think he just expected himself to be successful. Right? Yeah. Ego was not his issue, but having to deal with France was the bigger problem, and he failed. And the French like a strong leader, right? If you've ever been to Les Invalides and you see Napoleon's tomb, like if you're a strong leader, the French, I mean, they're happy with it. They like it. They prefer to elect a dictator every 5 years. That's how their system is set up, and the only thing that stops it is protest. And Macron wasn't able to overcome that.
They even like a strong German leader sometimes.
Yeah, which is a little more complicated.
Exactly. So what we haven't touched on, which is I think the root of I'm just of a belief that Europe is in the process of committing suicide as a civilization. Part of it is the unfettered immigration, but the other part is self-inflicted, and it's climate and the climate extremism, which is just. They're to a point that we haven't experienced even with all the climate radicalism of the 4 years of the Biden administration. We're not even close to you can't get air conditioning in certain European countries, and more people actually die of heat than cold. How is the climate extremism affecting Europe's economy and its ability to compete?
I think European leaders are right that climate's an issue. The science is well accepted. There are debates about the extent and the speed of it, and they've got that part down. But the solution goes back to them being a regulatory superpower. Right? They think that they can regulate themselves out of climate disaster, and that's not how it's going to happen. I'm optimistic in humanity in general. Even the Europeans, I'm optimistic if they change their minds, things could be a lot better, because there could still be a lot of innovation. It's coming out of the U.S. and China when it comes to climate, but the Europeans' problem is not how can we produce more energy in a way that doesn't create as many emissions, or maybe this gets more controversial questions about carbon capture and things like that, and we could do a whole other podcast on that. But instead of thinking of how are ways that we can all have more air conditioning and fewer emissions, they're just thinking, let's do fewer emissions and there won't be air conditioning. Right? That's like the debate in France. And Le Pen brilliantly has like a national air conditioning plan, because she figured out that actually people like to not be boiling hot in the summer in their own homes. And I've lived in parts of Europe where I didn't have air conditioning. It was not fun, I have to say. Maybe I'm like a soft American, but I also recognize that climate is an issue. I don't think the world is going to end and become uninhabitable within a decade. That's nutty. But how do we innovate our way out of it? The Americans are thinking about it. The Chinese, to a lesser extent, they're maybe not innovating as much, but they're certainly producing solar panels. Whereas the Europeans are just thinking of how do we make government bigger to solve this problem.
We were talking before the pod about Bill Gates just coming out and basically recently saying that the solution is mitigation. And this is something that Bjorn Longberg has been on our podcast multiple times and has said, is that you can't stop climate change at a economically acceptable way, that maybe you can possibly reduce emissions and slow it a little bit, but you can address the effects of climate change and make it more palatable. I mean, how much of the Netherlands is under sea level? Millions of people living under sea level. It's purely 2/3 of the country would be underwater if it wasn't for the system of dikes. You can actually build dikes at a very inexpensive way. It's cheaper to create air conditioning than it is to heat places. There's lots of things that we could do through technological innovation to mitigate the effects of climate on civilization. Stopping it from happening seems a little bit extreme.
I think there's a great recent book. Don't agree with everything in it. Breakneck by Dan Wang, comparing the U.S. and Chinese economies and our societies. And one particular passage that I really liked was he says, "I hate the phrase follow the science," because when he hears follow the science, he thinks about the one-child policy, which was by social engineers who are very well-respected scientists who just said, well, if we essentially prevent people, we sterilize people, we commit tens of millions, hundreds of millions of abortions, China will be better off. And that was following the science. And I think the Churchill line, and Dan Wang in the book quotes it, is you want scientists on tap but not on top. You need that information, and you need to be guided by being rooted in a basic set of facts. That's completely understandable. But scientists are not great at setting up public policy, as we learned during COVID, where either they did way too little or way too much. And you need policymakers to balance those challenges. I think in Europe, you have bureaucrats setting policy in a way that is really unhelpful to them. And that's not going to be the way to deal with climate change. I think it needs to be a mix of reducing emissions through innovation, but also mitigation, because you can't turn back. You can't turn back on economic growth. Yeah. The cure then becomes worse than the disease at that point. And so one goal we have as an editorial board is recognizing the reality of climate and thinking through how do we continue to make our lives better while dealing with whatever this challenge throws our way. And that's not something you can do here. That's a whole other podcast. That's countless editorials written over months and years. And that's how we'll hope to inform our readers and make them think a little differently and challenge them in a nonpartisan way, I should say, because I'm not really thrilled with how either party is approaching this particular issue in the U.S. or anywhere in Europe that I can see.
Right. There's no one great. So before we let you go, let's just talk a little bit about the Post. You've been there for a few months. Obviously, now you have to order everything from Amazon. But apart from the fact that you're getting all your pencils within 24 hours, like I always do, which is a great thing for you, tell us a little bit about what's changed. Is the Post a different, obviously we're talking about the editorial section, not the news section. What's different? Editorial meetings, editorial positions, is the Post a different paper than it used to be?
I could speak, as you alluded to, I could speak to the opinion section. There's a wall between news and opinion. I would say the opinion section, it's a new era. I spent a lot of time reading about the history of the Post before I took this job, and one of the things that became immediately clear was that there was never a Post tradition that lasted in perpetuity over the past 150 years. In the 19th century, at one point, the Post called for the annexation of Canada as their editorial position, which
not
is
a terrible idea.
I know somebody who actually wants to do that now.
Yeah. And so
that idea is back in vogue.
That's not very high up on my agenda for our editorial board. But we're rebuilding, and our North Star, our pillars, are free markets and personal liberties. And there are huge prudential debates within those pillars about tax rates, how the U.S. should be involved in different parts of the world. And we want to do two things. We want to do many things, but when it comes to the pillars, we want to host a debate within those pillars. Some people can debate about what the optimal tariff rate is. In a perfect world, people, goods, ideas, everything would move freely. And I think ideas should be moving around freely around the world. That's good. But there are security concerns. We've learned that unfettered immigration is difficult. So we'll host those debates within our op-ed pages and within our multimedia expansion, which is another thing. We want to be reaching people where they actually are. And the second thing is that we also, as an institution, as the editorial board, whether that's written editorials, video podcasts, whatever product we're producing, we want to be advocating for our own distinct vision of how to move the U.S. in a more free market direction in a way that maximizes human freedom and human flourishing. And we're in the process of building up the team. We've got great people in-house. Keith Richburg, one of our editorial writers, he's based in Asia, has a long career writing about foreign policy. Reporting is hugely important to us. And so we need people like Keith having their voices in our meetings. Karine Hajar, who's joining us from another paper, she'll be starting in November. Karine has great experience in the U.S. covering politics. She also has great experience writing about the Middle East. She's recently on a reporting trip in Lebanon, for example. And so we want people with international perspectives rooted, but we also want to bring in voices who traditionally weren't working in journalism, whether that's a veteran, someone who had been working on Wall Street, someone who has a lot of smart ideas about business, who's maybe a Midwestern businessman, but wants to be able to write more. We want to seek those voices, because when I look back and I'm looking around the newsroom, I want people who, when I'm sitting in meetings with, I'm learning from. So there's a lot going on. We're building out the editorial board. We're building a multimedia department. We're seeking out fresh contributors. We want to be able to reach people where they are. And this is all tied together by an optimistic vision that's rooted in core American values. And we like America, and we think things are going to get better. And that doesn't mean that we don't recognize the dangers or how things can go wrong, and we'll write about that very clearly. But it's kind of a unique thing for journalists to be generally upbeat and positive. And that goes beyond whoever is in the White House, whoever controls Congress, whatever the size of the Supreme Court is, but a general attitude of, okay, we're going to think about whatever public policy problem there is, whatever big cultural conversation that is, and think through what comes next, how can we positively contribute to that conversation, and who can we bring into the conversation who you traditionally don't see in a paper like The Post. And that's our way of winning back trust with our audience. And it's a long process. I've been here for about a little under 4 months, but that's the path we're on, and I'm very excited with the team that we have, all to be rowing in the same direction and to have that goal. It's the opportunity of a lifetime.
Well, as a member of that team, I'm really excited about it too.
Yeah, Mark's okay as well. We like having him around.
We could have a conversation about that.
But here's a question for you. So I mean, there was obviously a lot of attention paid to when the Post decided not to endorse Kamala Harris. A lot of people canceled their subscriptions. It was widely reported on that. But there has also been a slow canceling of subscriptions of people on the center right over many years, right? Sure. And what is your pitch to those people to take another look, who sort of have written off the Post because they thought it was too in the tank for the Democrats, too in the tank on the left? What is your pitch to those people to give it a second look now that there's a new direction?
Yeah, and so I'm not going to look backward on anything, and I could just say where we're going.
Yeah.
And I always say it, we're nonpartisan, which means if you open the paper, you're not going to know that we're going to reflexively defend the Republicans or the Democrats. And I think for some readers, for some members of the audience, that's a new thing, and they may or may not like it. They may expect us to formally announce our alignment with a particular party. That's over, and we're not going to do it. We're not going to be endorsing people. We're guided by our principles. And sometimes that will result in positions that the Post wouldn't have taken before, because we don't mind pointing out if someone in a different party is right about something. And so when it comes to the current occupant of the White House, we'll criticize him, we'll praise him, we'll say what things could be better, what things we were surprised by. That sort of, we're wide open. And so if you're on the center right and you felt excluded previously in the Post's coverage, I just encourage you to read. I'd encourage you to read, but also to listen to our podcasts, right, when we're doing more on social video, because we want to create a product that's for all of America. And there'll be times where you open the paper and you're just like, I can't believe this. But hopefully you'll learn something. And also for readers on the left, we have tremendous respect for the audience that we've built before. And if they just want to hear, if their product is, we'd only like to hear one perspective and we'd like it to be aligned, maybe they won't stick around. But we think that there's a much bigger audience of folks who will read things that they still believe in, center left, loyal Democrats. There's still plenty to offer for them, but also for folks on the right, they'll be finding things that maybe they wouldn't have seen before that are quite interesting. It's a really big tent under free markets and personal liberties, and I think it's going to take some time. You have to build a team, and we're making the extra effort to find people who wouldn't be in these roles. But over time, and you can already see it now, but over time, it's only going to get more interesting and add more value. So I'd say check us out, but stick around because it's a lot of fun, and you're going to learn something.
Amazing. Good for you. Good for you and good for everybody who's engaged in that. I stopped reading the Washington Post quite a long time ago, except for Mark's column, and sometimes not even that, let's be honest.
I read it every week.
I couldn't resist. I did. I stopped reading the Times, and I just, my husband, we subscribed to both of them because you kind of have to. But I relied on my husband to point out to me what I wanted to know from the New York Times, and I still read the Post, and then eventually I stopped reading the Post and I'm really happy. You want a newspaper. I love the Journal. I love the editorial page of the Journal, but I wish my hometown paper was more responsive to the diversity of people that exist in this country. So I'm thrilled.
Well, we're
Good
ending on
luck.
an optimistic note because
For
he
once.
got one reader back.
Yeah.
It all starts one reader at a time.
Yeah, and stay tuned for what we can do with AI, because you'll soon find your husband's role is redundant as our personalization gets better and better, and the stuff you really want in the Post will be served to you. But stay tuned for that. We're getting a little more interesting.
Great conversation. Thank you so much for coming in and taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay.
Pleasure.
Danny, what do you think?
So one of the things I actually did like, and I think is smart, is the reality that that the Post now wants to come to you. Lots and lots of people listen to The Daily, which is the New York Times daily news podcast. It's short, it's digestible, it's the news, all the news that they feel is fit to print, with all of the slant that the New York Times brings to every possible story on the face of the earth. And competition is good. We believe in competition 100%. I wouldn't like to see a country full of right-wing newspapers any more than I have enjoyed seeing a country full of left-wing newspapers. So I think it's great that they're going to be doing more. They just brought in a new multimedia honcho at the Post, and I think it will make a difference because there is an enormous amount of news garbage out there, and be nice to see that. I think that's one of the reasons why we enjoy our podcast is there are a lot of different mediums that people can listen to now, and the Post shouldn't just be a newspaper.
Yeah, because not everybody goes to the front stoop and picks up their print copy of the paper like you and I do.
I know.
Yes. Well,
actually, the only one we have delivered is the Financial Times.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, I don't get the Financial Times, but I get the Times, I get the Wall Street Journal, and I get the Post every morning.
I like the
and
FT.
I read all three.
I like the FT for a very straightforward reason. Because it's in the UK, it does a lot more foreign coverage. American newspapers, it doesn't matter whether they don't have the money to have foreign correspondents.
Well, I'm signing right now as we speak. I'm sending you a text message with the link to sign up for your print subscription to the Washington Post. So
there you go.
I know you committed. We got one more reader back.
No. We have the digital.
And it's the. I think we're already getting more, and it's the first of many, and that's a good thing. So it's a new era.
Good luck to the Post. So there are a lot of very rich people in America, and they've invested in various magazines and newspapers, and we've seen that. And what I really appreciate is somebody who simply wants to restore excellence. I think that makes a really big difference. They don't want to put their mark on it. They don't want it to be, a form of self-aggrandization. What they want is simply to restore something that once mattered. I think the fact that newspapers don't matter as much in America anymore is sad. We should be in the forefront. We should be leading the world in that place as well. And so I'm excited about this. This should be great.
I'm excited about it too. Well, thanks for another great pod, and we'll see you all next week.
Okay, that wasn't really Mark. He's been overtaken by a pod person. He didn't actually mean thank you, Danny, for another great pod. What he meant was thanks for being with us. Thanks for being with us this week, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.